Hello, my name is Jade Kramara. For my submission of Assessment 2, I'll be covering the statistical concepts of Type 1 and Type 2 errors, also known as false positives and false negatives respectively. A null hypothesis is where no relationship is found between two or more variables. Statistical significance is represented by the p-value. A p-value of 0.05 or less indicates a relationship, whilst a p-value of greater than 0.05 suggests there's no correlation between the variables. Putting these concepts together, if we found statistical significance, we could reject the null hypothesis, whilst if we didn't find statistical significance, we would accept the null hypothesis. In diagnostic tests, the correlation between the variables is the prevalence of disease and ability of a test to diagnose the disease. If a test diagnoses the disease, it's known as a positive result. If the test suggests the patient is clear of the disease or is in good health, they've received a negative result. But what happens if the test has misdiagnosed? Well, if the test has suggested a disease is present, but the patient is actually healthy, this is known as a false positive. Whilst the test suggesting health, but there is in fact a disease present, this is known as a false negative. Now that we know what a false positive and false negative is, where or how can we find it? I've used a diagnostic study to show you and referenced it on this slide. The purpose of this study was to find the efficacy of the aldosterone to renin ratio test at diagnosing primary aldosteronism. They compared this prevalence to a more widely used test known as saline infusion test, also known as SIT, which measures the level of angiotensin 1, or for the purpose of this study, the prevalence of primary aldosteronism. You can likely find the Type 1 and Type 2 errors reported in a diagnostic test, or finding the correlation within the text. The easier sections to start is likely the abstract, results, or discussion. It may be easier to understand this with a visual, so let's put it into a table. So in this test, they had 233 patients. Of these 233, the reference test, SIT, diagnosed 16 patients with primary aldosteronism, whilst the aldosterone to renin ratio test diagnosed 45 patients with primary aldosteronism. In this particular study, they've reported that 29 patients that were diagnosed with primary aldosteronism by the ratio test were misdiagnosed as the reference test didn't confirm the diagnosis. They also reported that all 16 patients that were diagnosed by the reference test, SIT, were also diagnosed by the ratio test. This bottom left box is the number of patients that did have primary aldosteronism but were not diagnosed to have it by the ratio test. But we just mentioned that all accurate diagnoses were all diagnosed by the ratio test, so this value is 0. It was reported that 188 patients weren't diagnosed with primary aldosteronism by either test, so this goes in the bottom right here. So what do these values mean? Well, now that we can see it better, let me tie the definition to the imagery. So the top left box represents the true positive, or the patients that were tested positive and did in fact have the disease. The top right box represents the patients that tested positive but didn't have the disease, also known as your false positive. The bottom left box represents the patients that tested negative but did in fact have the disease. This is known as your false negative. And the bottom right box represents the patients that tested negative and were in fact clear of the disease, also known as the true negative.